Hello. I am Hazelbot, and today we are going to lift the lid on the shady and secretive world of international sanctions. Sanctions are imposed by one country or a group of countries on people, ships and other countries, which restrict or prohibit financial dealings with a sanctioned entity. In an interconnected world of international trade and finance, a sanction can have a devastating effect. It is, at its heart, weaponized diplomacy. At its purest, sanctions on a country can apply economic pressure for that country to stop radical or unstabilizing behaviors and become a good global citizen. However, sanctions are often put in place for political purposes. Cuba has been under U.S. sanctions for 60 years, holding back economic development and arguably harming the welfare of Cubans, the very people the sanctions are purportedly in place to help. Restrictions aside, Cuba is a popular tourist destination and non-U.S. credit cards will work there. So why aren't the U.S. sanctions on Cuba effective internationally? Many countries find the sanctions to be unpalatable. The U.S. has been less vigorous in enforcing their own sanctions, and the U.S. government appears unwilling to expend political capital to convince other countries to enforce sanctions. The remaining U.S. sanctions remain in place for mostly political reasons. If they haven't worked in 6 decades, will they ever cause the changes in Cuba that the U.S. was hoping for? Ships are sanctioned when they are believed to be used for arms and drug smuggling, attempting to prevent them from using ports and gaining cargo services. People may be sanctioned when they are on terrorist, arms dealer or drug cartel watch lists, when politically allied to a person who is already sanctioned, or are in a position to pressure another person or state to act in a way the sanctioning countries want. To be sanctioned means that people, companies and governments are restricted or prohibited from financial dealings with that sanctioned entity. In practice, this means banks will refuse to transfer funds to, or receive funds from, the sanctioned entity. Often the bank is not allowed to tell their customer why the transaction cannot be processed. It is left up to the customer to work out they were trying to transact with a sanctioned person. The mechanics of sanctions monitoring are rather rudimentary. Organizations like WorldCheck compile and monitor sanctions lists, updating these lists when new sanctions are applied or lifted. Banks wanting to check they are not breaking sanctions will subscribe to a number of these lists, as determined by their own jurisdictions and legal regulations. Every time a change is made to the list, WorldCheck publishes the updated list to its subscribers, who then need to load it to their sanctions monitoring systems. Some of these lists are more reliable than others. Some lists contain entries with very common names and are vague about that person's country. Sanctions lists can generate very high levels of false positives, making it difficult for the bank to determine whether a transaction is allowable or not. The reach and power of a sanction depends on what country issues the sanction. On the simplest level, an Australian bank will enforce a sanction created by the Australian government because there are direct penalties to that bank for failing to do so. But how does a country like the USA enforce their sanctions on Australian banks? The major Australian banks hold US banking licenses and so can be subject to US fines or banking license restrictions. US banks also don't want to deal with sanctions-breaking banks as it harms their reputations and could have legal consequences for them. The foreign bank breaking sanctions may find they can no longer do business with any US banks and so lose access to US financial markets and the US dollar. A New Zealand sanction may prove to have a lesser effect on the world as they don't have sufficient political and financial sway to force international banks to comply. While seaport and airport customs officers check sanctions on ships and bills of lading, the most common sanctions checks occur on international funds transfers. The SWIFT MT-103 payment message sent between banks contains information on the sender and beneficiaries' names, source and destination countries and a description text field. All of these are scanned for sanctions hits at time of receipt, prior to funds being released. I wonder how many times Cuba Gooding Jr. finds his movie royalty payments delayed. Ha ha. The world of sanctions is a hidden and shadowy one. There is no single body that monitors or administers sanctions. Banks' interactions with sanctions are kept secret. The fact that Australian banks even participate in global sanctions checking is not widely known. It is sold as a method from preventing bad actors from moving funds around the globe, but can also be used for political purposes, and may well hurt the very people it is advertised as helping. Somewhere between the Cold War and a shooting war, sits sanctions. Not quite diplomacy and not quite an act of aggression.